Hi, everyone. You should see on your screen an ad for a study that's looking for participants. You can read the details of the study. It's looking at, I believe, interpreters. If you are interested in the study, you can either earn $60 for participating, or if you'd rather, you can earn 3 SONA credits for participating as well. There's some eligibility requirements that you have to meet in order to participate, so take a note of those. And if you are interested in participating, you can see a link down here and a QR code. So you might want to take a screenshot or something, and then you can use that, and it'll verify that you're eligible. And if you are eligible, I believe it'll take you to a calendar where you can sign up for the study. If you have any questions about the study itself, there's an email address down there as well. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that up there for another couple seconds in case anyone's interested in doing that. You should also note that exam 2 is next class on Tuesday. That's going to work the same way as exam 1. So we're going to do that all through Top Hat. There's going to be 30 multiple choice questions. So make sure that you are on time. I don't want you to be late because, as you know, once we go over a question, we can't go back, just in terms of the way that Top Hat works. So make sure that you are on time for Tuesday's class to take exam 2. Okay, so we've got a bunch of stuff to get through today. I want to finish off the lecture on cognitive dissonance by the end of today's class, and then we'll have a quiz at the end of class as well. So I left off last class talking about cognitive dissonance. So just to refresh your memory again, cognitive dissonance occurs when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with an attitude that we have, and that creates this negative, this uncomfortable, aversive arousal, which we're motivated to get rid of. And so we have multiple strategies that we talked about last class to try to get rid of that cognitive dissonance, things like changing your attitude, changing your behavior, minimizing the importance of the conflict, those sorts of things. I was giving you some examples of cognitive dissonance effects, and I had one more to give you. And that has to do with the war in Iraq. So in 2003, we went to war with Iraq. And I think that there was potential for cognitive dissonance to have played a role in what happened after we went to war with Iraq. So I want to explain to you what I mean. So let's imagine that Bush, the president at the time, had the following attitude: that he is not the type of person who would go to war with a country that doesn't pose a significant threat to America. Let's just assume that that's what his attitude is. Now, when we went to war with Iraq, it was because, or at least the justification at the time was because we believed they had weapons of mass destruction. However, and then we thought that they could use them against the US. However, when we got to Iraq, we discovered there were no weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's a bit of a problem, because if this was George Bush's attitude, well, his behavior was, well, we went to war with Iraq, which didn't pose a significant threat to America. So in other words, the behavior he engaged in going to war with Iraq was in conflict with his attitude, if we assume that he had that attitude. That's going to create a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? The behavior conflicts with the attitude. So let's look at some of the ways that Bush might have tried to reduce that cognitive dissonance. Okay, these are the 5 ways of reducing dissonance that I presented to you last class. And by the way, I'll also mention that a week from today, next Thursday's class, the first class after exam 2, I'm going to give an assignment, and that assignment is based on cognitive dissonance, and you're going to have to understand these 5 ways of reducing dissonance to perform that assignment. So make sure that you understand these 5 ways of reducing dissonance. Okay, we're going to look at each one of these in turn. So let's go through each of them in turn to see if Bush could have used the strategy to reduce the dissonance that was created when he went to war with Iraq. So we're going to start by looking at changing attitude. Okay, so changing attitude in this case, well, if his attitude was that he's not the type of person to go to war with a country that doesn't pose a threat, changing the attitude would be something like, well, maybe he can convince himself that he is the type of president who would go to war with countries that don't pose a threat to America. Well, it's theoretically possible that you could use that, but probably in this case, that's probably not going to work, right? He's not going to just change his whole idea of who he is, probably. So that's probably not a strategy that's going to work in this specific case. So let's look at some other strategies. What else could he do? Well, one thing he could do is to change his behavior. What does that mean? Well, that means that he could stop going to war with Iraq, right? Again, it's sort of theoretically possible, but there's a whole lot of political ramifications of doing this, such that you probably can't just go to war with Iraq and then pull out and leave sort of this power vacuum and that sort of thing. So probably for logistic reasons, that's probably not going to work as a way to reduce dissonance. So let's look at a couple other options. What about if he minimized the importance of the conflict? So remember, this is when you acknowledge that your behavior was in conflict with your attitude, but you just say, you know what, it's not that important. It doesn't really matter. In other words, he could say, well, it's not all that important that I went to war with a country that doesn't pose a threat to America. Well, chances are you can't really convince yourself that going to war is not really a big deal. So that's probably not going to work as a strategy. Let's look at another strategy. Let's look at reducing perceived choice. So this occurs when we convince ourselves that we were forced into that behavior. We didn't have a choice in the matter. So in this case, that would be George Bush saying something like, I had no choice. I was forced to go to war. Well, you're the most powerful man in the world. As the president of the US, you probably can't really convince yourself that you were forced to go to war. So that strategy's out. But we're left with one additional strategy. The last strategy we're left with is adding a consonant cognition. Remember, what this means is that we're adding a belief that is consistent with both our behavior and our attitude. So what could that belief be? Well, actually, we went to war with Iraq in part because we really wanted to give freedom to the Iraqi people who were suffering under Saddam Hussein. And so you can see that this is a new belief that's being added to the system, that's being added to his belief system, that is consistent with his behavior. He went to war with Iraq to give freedom to the Iraqi people. And it's also consistent with his attitude, which is that he's not the type of person to go to war with countries for no reason, that don't pose a threat. And so what happens is that if he can convince himself that he went to war with Iraq to give freedom to the Iraqi people, to liberate them, then that would reduce that cognitive dissonance. That would justify his behavior. So this would actually work as a strategy. And I know you guys, most of you were probably quite young at the time that we went to war with Iraq, given that is about 18 years ago. But at the time, what happened is that after we went to war with Iraq, which was initially justified as going there to find or to make sure they don't use their weapons of mass destruction against us, as we found out they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, the justification for the war also shifted, and it shifted towards this reason here, that in fact we went to war to give freedom to the Iraqi people. Okay? And so that would be consistent with this attempt to reduce cognitive dissonance from going to war. Okay, so you should be familiar with various ways that we have of reducing cognitive dissonance. And in fact, let's go over, or I'm going to have you guys practice how people are coming up with ways how people might reduce their cognitive dissonance. So I want you to imagine the following scenario. Imagine that Ed is a big believer in Ouija boards and he's used them hundreds of times. He has recently been told, though, that Ouija board phenomena don't let you actually talk to the dead. Remember, if you've ever used a Ouija board, the whole idea is that you're supposed to talk to the dead, and the dead move your hands around and spell out words and things like that. In fact, what's happening here is that no one's talking to the dead here. What's happening here is that Ouija board is the result of an ideomotor effect. Okay, and I'll just explain what the ideomotor effect is. If you've ever used a Ouija board, you know how this works. So you've got this planchette, and it rests on 3 little legs, and there's a little piece of felt in the bottom of each of these 3 legs, such that it slides really, really easily over the board. And so you've got 2 people who place their hands really lightly on the planchette, as you can see in the picture here. And then someone asks a question like, so if the idea is that you're talking to ghosts, you say something like, so what is your name? And then that planchette starts to move around the board, and it'll stop over a letter, which you can then see through this little glass piece here, and it'll start spelling out words. And if you've ever used a Ouija board, you might have, it sort of feels as if you're not controlling it, and that there's some other spirit that's guiding it, which is why people think it allows them to talk to the dead. In reality, what's happening is something called the ideomotor effect. So the ideomotor effect is this idea that your beliefs and expectations can be transmitted very subtly through little motions in your hand. Okay? So when you rest your hands really lightly on this planchette, if you're expecting a certain response, so let's say you ask a yes/no question. Let's say, are you my dead great-grandfather? And you're expecting that spirit to say yes. Those expectations get transmitted through your hand, and you start to slowly and very, very subtly move that planchette around. And importantly, you don't feel like you're doing it. You're not deliberately trying to control it, But the belief, the expectation that this spirit is going to answer yes, that expectation gets transmitted through little motions in your hand, which changes or which moves that planchette around. So that's really how Ouija boards work. Okay? And let's say that Ed is in the class right now, and I've just explained how Ouija boards aren't actually communication devices to talk to dead people. Well, what's happening here is that if he continues to use Ouija boards, then his attitude, which is that Ouija boards don't let you talk to the dead, is in conflict with his behavior, which is that he's still using Ouija boards. And that has the potential to create some cognitive dissonance. And so my question to you is, how might Ed reduce his cognitive dissonance in this specific case? And what I'd like you to do is to potentially type in some answers into the chat. This is basically or partly what you're going to have to do for your assignment. So it's good to get practice in doing it now. So what might Ed do? So reduce perceived choice. So what does that mean in this context? That's certainly an answer. It's certainly something he could do. So what does that mean? Reduces perceived choice of what? Anyone have an answer for me? Okay, well, reducing perceived choice in this context would mean that your behavior, which is that I'm using a Ouija board, was forced. Not that your hand was forced a certain way. It means your behavior was forced, right? So reducing perceived choice in this context would be something like if Ed were to say, well, everyone else was using the Ouija board and I had no choice. I had to go along with them. We were at a big party. Everyone else was doing it. I had to go along with it as well. I didn't choose to do it myself. I was forced to do it by my friends who wanted to use the Ouija board. Okay, so that's what that would mean in this context, reducing perceived choice. Okay, so that's one option. That would absolutely work to reduce his dissonance. What other ways might he have of reducing his dissonance as well? Remember, we're going back to those 5 strategies, right? So what's another strategy and how might he use that strategy? Yeah, so pressure fitting in could be, it's an example of reducing perceived choice, right? He felt like he had to do it to fit in. So what's another strategy? Let's try, let's take a simple one, simplest one of all, change his behavior. What would that mean? I mean, what's the behavior we're talking about? The behavior is using the Ouija board, right? And so changing the behavior would be stop playing with the Ouija board. So the first thing you want to do in these situations, we've got a hypothetical example of someone who's experiencing cognitive dissonance, is to figure out what is the attitude and what is the behavior, right? Figure out and how those things are in conflict. Okay, so he may convince himself that he was using the Ouija boards for jokes that he never really believed it worked. Perfect. So that's a good example of probably reducing or minimizing the importance of the conflict, right? So yeah, I use Ouija boards and I know they don't work, but I was just playing them for fun. It's not really a big deal. I didn't really believe them. It's just for fun, right? That's minimizing the importance of the conflict. That's a good example. Any other examples? Any other ideas? You still got a few strategies left from that list of 5 that I gave you. All right, let's go over a couple other ones. So what about changing his attitude? So if his attitude was that, and there's a couple of ways that he could actually change his attitude. So one way is that if his attitude was that he were to believe me and say, okay, Ouija boards actually are the result of the ideomotor effect, and yet I use Ouija boards, he could just simply choose not to believe what I say, right? Because if he were to adopt what I say, then that could create dissonance. So he could simply not believe what I say. He could change his attitude by not listening to me, basically, would be an example. Okay, we talked about change behavior. We gave an example of minimizing the importance of the conflict. We have an example of reducing perceived choice, feeling forced. Yeah, so that's kind of it. So people don't want to end up looking stupid or bad, so that's why they create dissonance. So sort of. So what happens, it's not so much that you're concerned about looking bad to others, it's that you're concerned that yourself, that there's a conflict between what you believe and what you did. And it just internally, even if no one else is around, we don't like to feel that conflict. Okay, so dissonance is created automatically when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with our attitudes, right? When we feel like we're being a hypocrite because we like to be consistent. We like that feeling of being consistent. Okay, let's try another example. Okay, so let's imagine this. So John has always claimed that he wanted to date girls that were intelligent and generous and that attractiveness doesn't matter to him. Recently, he met Kate, who's extremely attractive, but not intelligent and somewhat self-centered. Nonetheless, John dates her. Okay, so we're going to see some cognitive dissonance arise here because his attitude that attractiveness doesn't matter to me is in conflict with his behavior, which is that I'm dating someone purely because they're attractive, right? So his behavior and his attitude don't match. So let's say that you're friends with John and you call him out for this and you say, John, you said attractiveness doesn't matter and yet you're dating this attractive girl who doesn't seem to have these other characteristics you're looking for. What might John do in response? If he feels that cognitive dissonance, what might he do to try to reduce that dissonance? Okay, so let's see. Change his attitude, don't date her. Well, that would be an example of changing his behavior. He could stop dating her, which is changing his behavior, right? He may claim that she's smarter than she seems. Yeah, so, she's not book smarts, but she's street smarts, right? And so that's kind of like adding a consonant cognition, adding a new belief that's consistent with your behavior. Similarly, you could claim she has other characteristics that he likes. Maybe he likes loyalty and she's super loyal, right? Did I not say I like loyalty? Because I really like loyalty and she's really loyal, right? It's a new belief that's consistent with his behavior. He's dating her and is consistent with his attitude if he likes loyalty. So that's an example. Okay. Someone said, say looks do matter and he's dating her for that reason. Yeah, that's an example of changing the attitude then, not changing the behavior. So, because the attitude is that looks don't matter. So if you change your attitude, that would be saying that looks do matter. So he could just admit that looks do matter. Lack of choices while dating. He was forced. Yeah, there's no one else I could have dated. She's the only person I have that was single. So I had to date her for that reason. That's basically reducing perceived choice. Good. Minimize the importance of the conflict. Because there might be other factors he likes about her. Yeah, so if there are other factors he likes about her, then he's adding a new belief, right? So that's adding a consonant cognition. But minimizing the importance of the conflict would work. What would minimizing the importance of the conflict mean in this scenario? This would be John saying, yeah, I'm dating her and it goes against everything I'm looking for. But it's not that big a deal because I'm not going to marry her. I'm only casually dating, right? It's not a big deal. If he did something like that, that would be an example of minimizing the importance of the conflict. Okay, so I think we came up with a bunch of these examples here for each of these. So you can see that for any behavior that produces cognitive dissonance, there are, at least in theory, a number of ways that you can choose to reduce that dissonance, right? The way that people choose to reduce their dissonance is usually the way that they find the easiest. Like it might be hard to convince yourself you were forced to date Kate, for instance. It might be easy, and it might be hard to quit dating her because you don't want to. It might be easier to add a consonant cognition and actually say that actually she's really loyal and I really value loyalty. So that way, in that case, they might choose adding a consonant cognition. But every situation is going to differ. So people will pick a strategy that works easiest in any given scenario. So number 3, you have plenty of food to eat and receive high quality medical care. Millions of people in the world are starving and don't have access to the simplest of medical treatments. If you gave more money to charity, then you could save lives. Okay. So presumably, if you think of yourself as a good person and a generous person, it might become a little harder to maintain that view of yourself if you're faced with this idea that, well, you have expendable money and you don't donate money to charity. And had you just donated that money to charity, then maybe you could have saved lives. And so the fact that you chose not to donate money might have cost people their lives, it kind of conflicts with your attitude that you're a good, generous person, right? So if you were faced with this idea, that should tend to arouse some degree of cognitive dissonance within you. How might you reduce your own dissonance in this case? Okay, so one thing you do, change your attitude and say, I'm not a generous person. You could do that. That's sort of one of these options that's theoretically possible that would work to reduce dissonance. The problem is it conflicts with our other basic tendency that we have to want to see ourselves really positively, right? So it's theoretically possible, but most people probably won't do that. But it still works. Change behavior and start donating more. Yep, start donating money to charity. That would do it. There are people with more to spare that aren't doing anything either. Yeah, so keep in mind, this is a combination of things. This is partly the false consensus effect, right? Remember that the false consensus effect is this tendency that we overestimate how many other people also share in our undesirable behaviors. So in other words, we have a motivation to say, well, we don't donate money to charity, but no one else donates money to charity either. That's the false consensus effect, right? And that works though to reduce your dissonance, because what you're effectively saying is, I could donate money, but the amount of money I can donate isn't really going to have a big difference, right? I don't have millions of dollars that these other people have, and they could make a difference. So what you're doing is basically minimizing the importance of the conflict. It's not a big deal that I don't donate money, because that wouldn't, go to, it wouldn't really help people anyway. Maybe bigger companies donate, so it makes you feel okay that you don't donate. Yeah, so it's kind of the same idea that you can't donate a lot of money compared to these other companies that have a lot of money, and therefore it doesn't really matter that you don't donate, because it wouldn't really buy a whole lot for other people anyway. So that would work. What else? I can think of a couple other examples. We've got a couple other strategies, right? We've got reduce perceived choice. We've got adding a consonant cognition. So let's get one for each of those. What would reducing perceived choice mean in this context? And remember, reducing perceived choice means that your behavior was forced. Okay. So what is the behavior in this case? The behavior in this case is not donating money. So what would it mean to say that you're forced to not donate money? Well, what it means is, as you're pointing out, Carolina, claiming you don't have the means to donate, right? So in other words, you could say, I'm a poor college student. All my money goes to tuition and books, and I have no expendable income. If I have no expendable income, I can't help the fact that I don't donate. I'm forced to not donate, basically. And therefore, that's why. Yep, so that's good. Adding a consonant cognition. This one is, I find, always the trickiest one that people have to try to think of examples of adding a consonant cognition. So what's a belief that you could add that's consistent with your idea that you're a generous person, for instance? And it could be something as simple as, yeah, I don't donate to charity, but I gave a guy $1 on the street, a homeless man, $1 on the street yesterday, right? And by bringing that to mind, you're basically adding a consonant cognition, which is, I actually do care about people. I gave someone $1 the other day. Yeah, I might not donate, but I helped someone with their groceries. I donate my time. Yep, these are all good examples. Exactly. Okay, so we went through each one of those. You're a member of a group that thinks the world will end on October 21st, 2011. This is a real group that did exist 10 years ago. In order to join this group, what you had to do is sell all your possessions and cut off all your family members to prepare for the final days. October 21st passes and the world doesn't end. So this was an actual belief that people had at the time. There were actually billboards that people bought saying, like, prepare for the end of days on October 21st, 2011, that sort of thing. Here's like one of these billboards right here. The idea was that, like, the end of the world was going to start on May 21st and then actually end on October 21st. These women are, I guess, part of this group. They're remarkably happy, considering they believe the world is going to end very, very shortly. And so what's going to happen here? Now you've got a bunch of people who have joined this organization, this group, because of this one belief that the world is going to end. And they cut off their friends and they cut off their family. They sell everything they have. They quit school. They quit their jobs. Everything. They just believe entirely in this one belief, right? Then that belief turns out not to be true. What's going to happen here is that these people are going to experience massive amounts of cognitive dissonance, right? What's going to happen is that they've engaged in these behaviors. I've quit school, I quit my job, I sold my possessions, I cut off my family and friends for a belief that turned out not to be true. And if they were to accept that that belief is not true, then it calls into question, why did you just quit your job and cut off your friends and sell your possessions? That means you're not a very good decision maker, right? If you have to admit it's not true. So in other words, in order to deal with that massive amount of cognitive dissonance that's created, they're going to have to reduce their dissonance somehow. In fact, I'm not picking this randomly because Leon Festinger, the guy who created cognitive dissonance theory, he actually went undercover as a member of a cult. This is back in the 50s. It's a different cult, but the cult thought the world was going to end, and he kind of figured it probably wasn't going to end. And so he infiltrated the cult to see how these cult members would deal with when they faced up to the fact that their beliefs for which they basically devoted their entire lives, that the world was going to end, turned out not to be true. He wanted to know how people were going to cope with that. So we're going to come back to this idea. As far as 2011 is concerned, though, we see the same sort of process because the leader of this organization, his name was Harold Camping. And after October 21st, 2011 came and passed, he was interviewed. And in the interview, he said the following: I can tell you very candidly that when May 21st came and went, it was a very difficult time. I was wondering what is going on. In my mind, I went back through all the promises God has made, all the proofs, all the signs, and everything was fitting perfectly. So what in the world happened? I really was praying and praying, oh Lord, what happened? What he decided, apparently, was that May 21st had been an invisible judgment day of the spiritual variety. Okay? Now, to someone like us who's not in this cult, okay, who's not in this organization, that sounds like a pretty poor justification for being wrong, right? He could have said, I was wrong, but that's not what he's saying, because by admitting he's wrong, that would create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. So what he did is he justified his beliefs by saying it was an invisible judgment day. You can't notice a difference, but it's there in the background. Okay, I promise you, it's an invisible judgment day of the spiritual variety, whatever that means, right? So what's likely going on here is he is trying to reduce his cognitive dissonance by justifying his belief, by saying, I wasn't actually wrong, it's just that you can't really see what happened. We're going to see what, in a moment, we're going to see what the cult members did when Festinger infiltrated that cult. So if you recall, we had talked about last class, and we were talking up until now. And actually, Carolina, you're pointing out the same things happening right now. People follow the QAnon stuff. You're right. I was considering talking about that, actually, is that these are people who had very strong beliefs that, for instance, Trump was going to be inaugurated on January 20th. And obviously that did not happen. And instead of abandoning their beliefs, they believe there's other things going on. They had to quash their cognitive dissonance. And so they believe currently that there's things going on behind the scenes and Trump is actually president still and is operating Biden like a puppet and things like that. Things that sound kind of crazy to us, right? But the reason they sound crazy to us is because we're not in that cult. For the people who are in that organization, they need a way to reduce their cognitive dissonance, and they can't admit that their beliefs were wrong, so they're looking for ways to justify their beliefs. Okay, so far we've been talking about one domain in which we see cognitive dissonance, which is that when we're trying to justify our attitude discrepant behavior. And I'd mentioned, though, last class that there's two other domains in which we see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects as well. And the second domain in which we see these effects is when we have to justify effort. Okay, here's the basic idea. When we suffer in order to join a group, then we feel a need to justify having willingly undergone all that suffering. So for instance, let's say that you want to join a sorority or fraternity or whatever, and you get hazed, and there's like a week-long hazing, and you're being humiliated, and like you're going through all this suffering for that week, and then you join the fraternity or sorority. And then when you join, you realize that, oh, this kind of sucks. I don't want to be here. I don't really like this organization at all. Well, if you were to admit that to yourself, then you've got to think, well, then why did I willingly go through all that suffering for a week in order to join a group I didn't want to be in the first place? That calls into question your ability as a decision maker, right? As a consequence, it's going to produce a lot of cognitive dissonance because your behavior, which is that I underwent this suffering, is at odds with your attitude, which is that I don't like the group that I suffered in order to get into. That's going to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. Just like the case with the cults, right? Or these organizations where if you believe the world is going to end and you sell all your possessions and the world doesn't end and you admit that your beliefs were wrong, then why did you sell all your possessions and cut off your family and quit your job? That's going to create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. As a consequence, we always feel a need to justify whatever we suffer for. In fact, we've seen this already in this class, because in the first or second week of the class, I gave you, when we were talking about research methods, I talked about a study just to sort of demonstrate how you go about designing a study. And I mentioned we were going to come back and talk about that study later, and now is when we're coming back to talk about it. So just to refresh your memory, this is a study in the 60s where women joined or they participated in a study where they were told they were going to be having a discussion on sex. When they got to the lab, they were met by a male experimenter who randomly assigned them to one of three conditions. For 1/3 of the women, they did not have to suffer in order to join the group. They didn't have to be initiated, so they just immediately joined this group discussion. For 1/3 of the women, they underwent a mild initiation where they had to read off a list of slightly sexually suggestive words like bed, underwear, things like that. And a third group of women were randomly assigned to a condition in which they underwent a severe initiation, where they read off a list of like XXX rated words, which is really embarrassing for them in front of a strange male experimenter. Everyone then joined a group discussion. And if you recall, they entered a booth by themselves, they put on headphones, and they basically just listened to this discussion. So the discussion was identical for everyone. And it was on the secondary sexual characteristics of invertebrates, like the most boring discussion you can imaginable. This is what how the authors of the study described it: one of the most worthless and uninteresting discussions imaginable. Okay. So afterwards, all the women then rated how much they liked that group discussion. And so here are the results of that study. So the women who underwent no initiation said that they really hated it. They recognized that it was a really boring discussion. The women who underwent a mild initiation also recognized it was really boring and basically hated it as well. But the women who underwent a severe initiation, when you later ask them how much they liked the study or the discussion, suddenly they report really finding the discussion interesting and enjoyable, and they'd like to come back and have another similar discussion. Now, what's going on here? It's not that these women are lying. These women aren't trying to tell someone else how much fun the discussion was. What's happened is that these women have justified the initiation that they went through. So in other words, if they willingly chose to undergo this initiation, to embarrass themselves in front of this experimenter by reading off this list of words, they willingly embarrassed themselves to join this discussion. And if they got there and they decided, you know what, this discussion was not worth having embarrassed myself, then that's going to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. They're going to start thinking, well, why did I choose to undergo that initiation? What does that mean about my abilities as a decision maker, as an intelligent person? So in order to avoid that, they justified their effort. They convinced themselves that, you know what, I really actually like this discussion. It was really enlightening. I really learned a lot from it. Because that way, that would justify having gone through that initiation. Okay. So this is what we're seeing here, is that cognitive dissonance arises when we have to justify our past effort for having joined a group, for instance. Okay, we actually see this with hazing rituals. I kind of gave you an example already with like a fraternity or a sorority that hazes people. There are studies that show that people who undergo hazing end up liking the group more once they get in than people who don't undergo hazing, which seems counterintuitive at first because these are the people who made you suffer that you're now joining. And how could you like the group more if these are the people who made you suffer? But the reason makes sense from a social psychological perspective. Because having undergone that suffering and having willingly chosen to undergo that suffering means these people have to justify having gone through that suffering, which they do by convincing themselves that they really, really like this group. So, and again, what we're seeing is that they're not doing this to impress other people. They're not doing this so that other people think they're a good decision maker or anything like that. They're doing it for themselves, right? Cognitive dissonance is an internal process that we're not doing it to look good in front of other people. We're doing it so that we feel good about ourselves. All right, so I mentioned that Festinger infiltrated this cult, right? And he wrote a book of his experiences called When Prophecy Fails. You can read all about it in this book if you wanted to. I'll give you a synopsis of what happened here. So this was a group called the Seekers. And the Seekers were led by a woman by the name of Miriam Keach. And Miriam Keach claimed to be in contact with an alien race called the Guardians. Okay? And the Guardians had told her that the end of the world is coming. In particular, on, I think it's the 21st of I can't remember if it's October, I can't remember what it was exactly, or December, I think it was, that a big flood was coming in 1954. And a big flood was going to come and wipe out the world. But fortunately, this alien race was going to save the people within this cult. They're going to save the Seekers. So in order to join this cult, basically you had to quit your job and quit school and sell your possessions. I mean, you're not going to need your possessions once the world ends, right? And the friends and family, they didn't like they knew this was kind of a cult. So the cult members had to basically cut them off, right? And so Festinger, pretending to be one of these cult members, joins this organization, right? And so the night before, the flood is supposed to come at midnight on the 21st, I think. And so everyone goes to this one centralized location, awaiting the Guardians coming down in their spaceship and taking them all aboard the spaceship and taking them off of Earth before the flood wipes out the Earth. So they're all kind of nervous and they're all gathering there. And they're realizing that you're not allowed metal on board the spaceship for whatever reason. And so the men are cutting out like the flies, the zippers in their pants, right? And the women realize they've got underwire in their bras. So they're ripping out the underwire in their bras. And they're memorizing passwords that they need to know to get on this spaceship, right? And suddenly it's like quarter to midnight. So everyone thinks the spaceship is coming. And so they all gather and they're all silent and you can cut the tension with a knife, right? They're all really, really excited. And the clock strikes 12 and nothing happens. And this is the moment Festinger's been waiting for, right? How are these people going to cope when they realize that everything they believed turns out to be false? How are they going to cope with the massive amounts of dissonance that are created? And the clock strikes 12:05 and nothing's happened and people are starting to freak out a little bit. And then it's 12:10 and it's 12:15, it's 12:30, and people are really freaking out at this point, right? I mean, they believe a flood is going to come, wipe out the Earth in a matter of hours, and their one saving grace was the spaceship that was supposed to come save them, and it hasn't shown up. And as it has it not shown up, and they're still going to die, or are their beliefs wrong, and no one really knows what's happening. And it's 1 a.m, and it's 2 a.m, and it's 3 a.m, and it's 4 a.m. And at that point, Miriam Keach leaves and goes into another room, the leader of this organization. She comes back a few minutes later and she says, I've got great news. I've been in contact with the Guardians, and they told me that our little organization has spread so much light in the world. We've educated so many people that they've decided to save the world from the flood, and that's why they didn't come. Okay, now you and me, as outsiders to this cult, we might think this is ridiculous, right? That's a ridiculous justification. Like clearly your beliefs were wrong and you're just justifying it after the fact, right? But to people who were inside the cult, these people needed to justify why they quit their jobs and why they cut off their friends and family and sold their possessions. And so they latched onto this argument and they erupt in applause and they cheer and they're high-fiving each other and they're all happy, right? Because that allows them to justify their past actions. I mean, if I saved the world by being part of this cult, by being part of the Seekers, that justifies why I cut off my friends and family and sold my possessions and quit school and quit my job. That justifies it all, right? So they latched onto that explanation. So it seems, what seems ridiculous to us as outsiders was believable to them because they needed something to latch onto to reduce their cognitive dissonance. Okay, and that's sort of what we saw with the Harold Camping example, when the 2011 cult that believed the world was going to end, right? They latched on to an explanation that sort of seems ridiculous to us, but they needed to latch onto it. They needed to believe it because that would reduce their cognitive dissonance. Here are some quotes from the cult members. So these are quotes from before it was found out that the aliens weren't coming. Okay, so this is when they still believed the flood was coming. I have to believe the flood is coming on the 21st because I've spent all my money. I quit my job. I quit computer school. I have to believe. If you think about this, that's kind of weird, right? They're not saying, I have to believe because there's evidence for this, right? I have to believe because it makes logical sense that these aliens are going to come. I have to believe because I've spent my money. I have to believe because I quit my job. Well, what does that even mean? Well, it requires an understanding of cognitive dissonance to really know what they're saying. What they're saying is, I expended all this effort. I spent my money. I quit my job. I quit computer school. And because of those things, I have to believe because I have to justify it somehow. And so to justify their past behavior, that convinces them to believe in this thing. Or this person, I've had to go a long way. I've given up just about everything. I've cut every tie. I've burned every bridge. I've turned my back on the world. I can't afford to doubt. I have to believe, and there isn't any other truth. And again, we see the same thing. They're not saying I believe because it makes sense or because there's evidence or because it's logical. They're saying I believe because I've turned my back on the world, because I've cut every tie, I've burned every bridge. I can't afford to doubt, right? What they're saying is they're describing their psychological process. I have to believe because I need to justify why I did all those things. And the only way I can justify it is if my belief is true. And so that's why I believe it. So you can like read into the cognitive dissonance reduction strategies they're using directly from these quotes. Okay, a third domain in which we see cognitive dissonance effects occurs when we're faced with the decision. Which of two jobs do I want to take? Which of two schools do I want to go to? If you're lucky, which of two people do I want to date, right? And what happens is that we can struggle with that decision and we don't know which of these two options to take. But what happens is that as soon as we pick one option, cognitive dissonance reduction strategies kick in. Because what we don't want to do, let's say we're choosing between which of two schools to go to graduate school to. What we don't want to do is pick a school and then realize we picked the wrong school. We should have picked the other one. That's going to make us feel bad. That's going to create all this dissonance because my behavior, which is I picked this school, conflicts with my attitude, which is that I should have picked the other school. And now that questions my abilities as a decision maker. How can I think of myself as an intelligent decision maker if I pick the wrong school, right? So what happens is that once we pick one of two options, we start justifying that choice. We start rationalizing it. We do this by thinking of only the positive things of the option we chose and only the negative things of the option we didn't choose, right? That way we come to convince ourselves that of course we picked the right option all along. That's what justifying difficult decisions is, okay? We do this all the time. You've almost certainly done this. I've done this. I've seen people do this like in real time. You'll see people do this as well, that as soon as they pick something, as soon as they've committed to something, we start justifying it. This is sometimes called the spreading of alternatives for reasons that you will see on the next slide. But before we get there, let me describe to you a study that looked at this. And what these researchers did is they went to a mall and they laid out a table. And on this table, there were 8 different kitchen appliances. And they pretended they were doing some market research. So they would stop random people who were walking around the mall and say, hey, excuse me, would you like to participate in this little marketing research we're doing? What I would like you to do is to rank order these 8 items in terms of which would you most like to have, which would you least like to have. And so these items are things like maybe there's an ironer or a food processor or a toaster or a popcorn machine or just things like this. So people would rank order them from most desirable to least desirable. Then what the researchers would do is whatever that participant chose as the 4th and 5th best choice, okay, so right in the middle, the researcher would say, well, it's your lucky day because we just so happen to have 2 of these products. Let's say the person ranked the toaster 4th and the popcorn machine 5th. They would say, okay, so we have a toaster and a popcorn machine. These are the 2 that we have. As a thank you for participating in this study, we'd like to give you the option of choosing one of these to take home. Which would you like, the toaster or the popcorn machine? So people would pick one or the other. And then the researchers would have people rank order all of these appliances one more time. So what we're going to look at is how attractive people found those 2 products. Okay, so we're going to look at the chosen item, the item that they chose to take home for free, and the item they chose to give up, right? So if they chose the toaster over the popcorn machine, then the toaster would be the chosen item and the popcorn machine would be the unchosen item. So what happens is that at the beginning, when they first rank order these appliances, the toaster and the popcorn machine are pretty evenly ranked, right? They're basically equally attractive. One was like the fourth most attractive, one was the fifth most attractive. They're basically equivalent in terms of attractiveness. But what happens is that once the participant chooses one of those items, say it's the toaster, when they re-rate those items, that item becomes much more attractive. And the item they didn't choose, let's say the popcorn machine, becomes much less attractive. This is why this is sometimes called the spreading of alternatives, because the attractiveness of two things is very similar before you make a choice between them. But as soon as you choose one or the other, suddenly they spread apart in attractiveness. The chosen item becomes much more attractive. The unchosen item becomes much less attractive. This is a result of trying to reduce your cognitive dissonance. These people didn't want to choose the toaster and then 5 minutes later realize, oh, they should have chosen the popcorn machine. So to avoid having to do that, as soon as they choose the toaster, all they think about are all the great things they can do with the toaster. And you know what? They don't even like popcorn anyway, right? And if they can convince themselves of that, then they can convince themselves that of course they made the right choice. They never have to experience buyer's remorse, in other words. Yes, the participants were asked to rate the items again after choosing them. That's correct. Yeah. Okay. So you can see this as a type of cognitive dissonance reduction. And what this means is that in your life, you're going to have some choices to make. Maybe you're going to have to decide which of two graduate schools you want to go to. And you can rest assured that even though that decision seems really complex and you really struggle with it, for weeks you might struggle with it, the moment you make that decision, you can rest assured that your natural psychological processes are going to kick in. And it's going to lead you to try to reduce your dissonance by convincing you made the right choice. I mean, I have this to this day. When I was going to graduate school, I was deciding between Iowa State and the University of Arizona. And I literally struggled with that decision for weeks. I didn't know which one to go to. And I finally picked Iowa State. Right here today, sitting here today, I can't believe how I ever considered the University of Arizona. Like clearly the Iowa State was obviously the better choice for me. And I know that the only reason I think that is because I have reduced my cognitive dissonance. I've convinced myself that whatever I chose, which is Iowa State, of course, that was obviously the best choice for me. That reduces my dissonance. But even though I know that's what I've done psychologically, it feels very real. It feels like, of course, I was always going to pick Iowa State. Okay, you'll experience this yourself, and you probably have in the past. You can see this in other contexts as well. There are some studies showing that people view potential like romantic partners as less attractive if they're currently in a committed relationship. Because if you're in a committed romantic relationship where you're not seeing anyone else, what you're basically doing is choosing to be with this person at the expense of every other person in the world. You're choosing that person, right? And so to avoid the cognitive dissonance that would be associated with realizing you made a bad choice, once you enter a committed relationship, you start these cognitive dissonance reduction strategies. You convince yourself that the person you chose to be with is the best person you could be with, and all these other people don't stack up. Now, of course, there are a lot of bad relationships people end up. So over time, you might end up realizing you made a bad choice, of course. But at least at the beginning, that's what we tend to do, is justify our choice. In order for cognitive dissonance to occur, there are a few necessary components. There's a few things that have to exist in order for cognitive dissonance to be produced. I just want to briefly talk about these. First off, the behavior that conflicts with your attitude, that behavior that we engage in must produce negative consequences. So in all the examples I talked about, those negative consequences usually refer to how we see ourselves. So for instance, if I chose to go to Iowa State over the University of Arizona, and then I realized that I should have picked the University of Arizona, that calls into question my abilities as a decision maker. That means I made a bad decision. I have to regret that decision. That's a negative consequence, right? In all the examples I gave, the behavior leads people to think that, that maybe I'm a hypocrite, or maybe I'm not a good decision maker, or whatever it is that has negative consequences to themselves. So those negative consequences are necessary for cognitive dissonance to occur. In other words, sometimes we might do something that conflicts with an attitude, but it doesn't have any negative consequences for how we see ourselves. And if that's the case, we don't really feel bad. We don't really care about it that much. So cognitive dissonance only arises when the behavior that we engaged in that conflicts with our attitudes has these negative implications for how we see ourselves. Furthermore, those negative consequences had to have been freely chosen and foreseeable. In all of the cognitive dissonance studies that we have discussed, people always have to feel free to choose the behavior that conflicts with their attitudes. So even if we go back to the original cognitive dissonance study, where people told someone else, they lied to someone else and told them how much fun a really boring study was. If you just simply told someone that they had to do that, you have to go tell someone else how much fun the study is, that doesn't produce cognitive dissonance. Because for dissonance to occur, you have to feel like you freely chose to engage in that behavior. And that by freely choosing to engage in that behavior, you realize that there's these negative consequences for you. Okay, so you have to feel personally responsible for having chose to engage in the behavior that conflicted with your attitude. Third, cognitive dissonance literally refers to a negative state of physiological arousal, okay? Meaning that in theory, you should be able to measure that physiological arousal. Like maybe it'll make your heart beat faster and your palms will get clammy, or you'll have some sort of physiological reaction when you experience cognitive dissonance. It's like a really physical feeling of discomfort when you're in that state. And this idea that arousal is a required component of cognitive dissonance is going to be really important for what we're going to discuss for the rest of today's class, as we're going to see. Yeah, anger, it probably wouldn't be anger so much as it would be like, oh, I feel really like hypocritical or something along those lines, or I feel like I made a bad decision. It just gets sort of that feeling of discomfort as opposed to anger per se. And you don't have to worry about this one too much. I'm not going to ask any questions on this fourth one because I just don't have time to get into it. But basically, if you experience those negative physiological responses to your behavior, if you feel that cognitive dissonance, you have to realize that the reason you're feeling that way is because of your past behavior. In other words, cognitive dissonance occurs when we have that negative physiological arousal, and we realize that we're experiencing that arousal because of what we just did, because of the behavior we just engaged in. There are some situations in which you can experience that negative arousal, but you think it was caused by something else. Maybe you think it was caused by because you had a whole bunch of coffee and that coffee raised your physiological arousal levels. And under those conditions, we don't engage in cognitive dissonance reduction strategies because we don't realize what we're experiencing is cognitive dissonance. Okay, but don't worry too much about that last component because I just don't really have too much time to get into it. Okay, so when cognitive dissonance theory was first published, it set off a ton of research. Like there were hundreds and hundreds of studies that were being conducted testing different predictions of cognitive dissonance theory. It became the most popular theory in all of social psychology because it has so many implications for how we live our lives. And for probably 12 or 15 years, that's what people talk about, cognitive dissonance theory. Until the early 1970s, when a guy by the name of Daryl Bem came along, and he published a hugely influential paper. This is the guy who came up with self-perception theory. We've seen self-perception theory already in this class, right? So self-perception theory says that we learn about ourselves by observing our own past behavior, right? So the example I gave in class was like, if you're trying to figure out what kind of music you like, and you think, well, every time I'm in my car, I listen to heavy metal, so therefore I must like heavy metal. Okay. So this is that same self-perception theory, but in a slightly different context. When Daryl Bem first published his paper on self-perception theory, what he said was that he can explain every single study that's ever been performed on cognitive dissonance, except that he can explain it with a new theory. And his theory is better than cognitive dissonance theory. Let me explain to you what his theory is, and then I'll mention why he claimed it was better. Okay, so what Daryl Bem says with self-perception theory is that we learn, or we infer, I should say, we infer what our attitudes are. In other words, we come to a rational conclusion about what our attitudes must be by thinking about our past behavior and the context in which that behavior occurs. So just to juxtapose these two theories, cognitive dissonance theory says that we justify our past behavior. We rationalize it. We distort information. We lie to ourselves to convince ourselves that the behavior we engage in was really consistent with our attitudes. Okay, that's what cognitive dissonance theory is. It's about delusion and lying to ourselves a little bit. Self-perception theory says that's all wrong. Self-perception theory says is what's actually happening is a purely rational process, that we're coming to a rational conclusion about what our attitudes must be by thinking about our past behavior. And this is going to be probably easier to explain by going over past cognitive dissonance studies and explaining them in terms of self-perception theory, so you can see how the explanations differ. The key here, and the key that differentiates these two theories, is that in self-perception theory, there is no physiological arousal. Okay, and remember, in cognitive dissonance theory, that negative feeling, that negative arousal you experience, motivates people to justify their behaviors. It motivates people to lie to themselves, to delude themselves. In self-perception theory, Daryl Bem says there is no negative arousal, so there's no need to justify anything. We're just coming to rational conclusions. So here's the idea. Let's go back to the original cognitive dissonance study, where people who engaged in a really, really boring task then told someone else how much fun the study was. So they basically lied to that person. And if you recall when we first talked about the study, the people who were paid $1 to lie had to somehow convince themselves that they didn't actually lie. And they convinced themselves of that by convincing themselves that in fact the study they just participated in was a whole lot of fun. That's how they rationalized their lie. People who were paid $20 though to lie, to say how much fun the study was, they already had sufficient justification. They already had a good reason. They were given $20. They were willing to lie for $20. As a consequence, they didn't feel the need to lie to themselves. So what happened is that people who were only paid $1 to lie came to really, really like the study a lot more than people who were paid $20 to lie. And we explain that in terms of cognitive dissonance theory already. Let's explain it in terms of self-perception theory. According to a self-perception theorist, what really happened was this. So these participants just lied to another participant, right? They just lied to someone, telling them how much fun the study was. And now they're asked, okay, now what is your actual opinion on the study? Did you actually like it or not? So imagine you're one of these people who was paid $20 to lie. So what you think is this? Well, let's see. Did I like that study? Well, I mean, 5 minutes ago, I just told someone how much fun the study was, but I was paid $20 to do so. So when I said that, I probably just did that for the money. And if I just said that for the money, then what that probably means that I didn't really like the study at all. Okay. Now note here that in that explanation I just gave, that person is not lying to themselves. They're not justifying anything. They're not rationalizing anything. It's a very logical conclusion, right? I told someone how much fun the study was, but I was paid $20. So that means I probably didn't mean it. So therefore my attitude is that I didn't like the study. So that's what I mean when I say that self-perception theory assumes that people come to rational, logical conclusions. But now let's take people in the $1 condition. These are the people who in the original study I initially said experienced cognitive dissonance. These are the people who rationalized their behavior by convincing themselves they liked the study, right? What Daryl Bem says, or what self-perception theory says, is that's not what happened. What happened is this. If you're one of these participants and you're asked how much fun was the study you just participated in, you start thinking, well, 5 minutes ago, I just told someone else how much fun the study was. And I was only given $1 to do that. So I didn't do it for the money, obviously, because that's not enough. So if I didn't do it for the money, that must mean I really did like the study. So they report really liking the study. And again, note that that person is not lying to themselves. They're not rationalizing or justifying anything. They're coming to a rational conclusion, right? I mean, I told someone else how much fun the study was. I wasn't paid to do that, so I must have meant it. So therefore, I must have liked the study. It's a very rational, logical sequence of events. And so what that means is that that one study can be explained in terms of cognitive dissonance theory, in terms of justifying behavior, or in terms of self-perception theory, where people come to rational conclusions. And what Daryl Bem said is just like he can explain this original study using self-perception ideas, he can explain every study that's ever been performed on cognitive dissonance using the same sort of logic. I'll give you some examples. So we talked about these examples last class. So in this study, participants who gave a speech, so we talked about this last class, right? So people who gave a speech about why it's important to always use condoms, if they believed they were giving that speech publicly, I mentioned that they took more condoms themselves and they used more condoms in their own daily life. And the idea that I gave when I presented this was that they did this to avoid any cognitive dissonance that would arise later on. In other words, they don't want to be hypocrites that make them feel bad if they just gave a speech that says you should always use condoms and they don't use condoms themselves. So to avoid that dissonance, to avoid that feeling of being a hypocrite, they took more condoms themselves. Okay. That's the cognitive dissonance explanation. The self-perception theory explanation would be that when these people were given this bowl of condoms and they were trying to figure out how many condoms do I want, they're thinking, well, what's my attitude towards condoms? Well, 5 minutes ago, I gave a speech about how we should always use condoms. And that was going to be shown to like all these high school kids all around the country, right? I wouldn't have done that if I didn't really believe that. So therefore, I guess I must be very pro condom. So I guess I should take a lot of condoms now. Okay. So again, what you're seeing is that people are coming to a rational, logical conclusion. They're not justifying anything. They're not trying to avoid any potential future cognitive dissonance. They're just coming to a rational conclusion about what their attitude is towards condoms. If there's an added pressure, it's dissonance. No, what differentiates them is whether you're justifying a behavior or whether you're coming to a rational conclusion about your behavior. That's the key difference, right? Are you justifying and rationalizing to avoid feeling uncomfortable? If so, that's cognitive dissonance. Or are you making a rational inference, coming to a rational conclusion based on observing your past behavior? If so, that's self-perception theory. So the good deeds, this is the example where Benjamin Franklin had an enemy in the legislature, and Benjamin Franklin borrowed a book from him. And then at that point, they became friends. And when I initially mentioned that, I talked about how that's due to cognitive dissonance. So if you're Benjamin Franklin's enemy, if you loan a book to someone, well, we don't loan books to our enemies, right? We don't do a favor for our enemies. The behavior and the attitude conflicted. I did a favor for this person, but I don't like this person. To get rid of that cognitive dissonance, they convinced themselves that actually I really kind of like Benjamin Franklin. They convinced themselves they like Benjamin Franklin. He was really a friend, and therefore, because he's a friend, that's why I did him a favor. There's a justification of that behavior, right? A self-perception theorist would say that's not what happened. What happened is that imagine you're Benjamin Franklin's enemy, and you're thinking, what is my attitude towards Benjamin Franklin? Do I like him or do I not like him? Well, last week I loaned him a book, and I would only loan books to friends. So therefore, I guess that means I must like Benjamin Franklin. So again, what we're seeing is that that person, that hypothetical person, is not justifying their behavior. They're not justifying why they gave him that book. They're coming to a rational conclusion that if I gave him that book, it must be because I'm friends with him. It must be because I like him. I talked about cheating. These are the kids who had sort of mild attitudes towards cheating. And then some kids cheated and some kids didn't cheat. And the kids who cheated became much more positive towards cheating. They became much more accepting of it. And I mentioned that what these kids did is they had to become accepting of it because they had to justify the fact that they just cheated. If they just cheated, then they said, cheating's a really bad thing, you shouldn't do it. They're going to feel like hypocrites, right? So to justify their past behavior, they change their attitudes. That's the cognitive dissonance theory explanation. The self-perception theory explanation is that these kids were thinking, well, let's see, what's my attitude towards cheating? Well, 5 minutes ago, I was put in a position to cheat and I did. I cheated. So therefore, I guess I must have pretty positive attitudes towards cheating. Okay? Again, not rationalizing their behavior, just coming to a rational conclusion about their behavior. The point is that for any study that had been performed on cognitive dissonance theory that seemed to give evidence for cognitive dissonance theory, you could have a self-perception theory explanation for that same finding. And Bem argued that in his theory, he didn't need to assume that people experienced this negative arousal, that people felt uncomfortable. He didn't need to assume that. Therefore, he argued his theory was simpler than cognitive dissonance theory, and therefore that his theory should be preferred over cognitive dissonance theory. Well, future researchers tested these two theories, because what you can do is that you could run one of these studies, any of the studies we talked about, you could run, and then you can have some measure of people's physiological arousal. Remember that in cognitive dissonance theory, you have to experience physiological arousal. That's literally what cognitive dissonance is. In self-perception theory, you don't experience any arousal. And so by measuring if people experience arousal or not, you can tell, you can differentiate between these two theories. When they conducted these studies, and I'm not going to get into how they did this, when they conducted these studies, what they found out is that they're both right under different circumstances. The key is this: if people engage in a behavior that's very different from their attitude, that's very discrepant, we feel like hypocrites. We experience that negative physiological arousal. People feel cognitive dissonance. However, when the discrepancy between our behavior and attitude is small, in other words, we engage in a behavior that's a little bit different from our attitudes, but not too much, that's not enough for us to feel like hypocrites. It's not enough for us to feel bad, so cognitive dissonance theory doesn't really apply. What happens then is that people infer, we come to conclusions about what our attitudes must be through a self-perception process. So it all hinges on how different the behavior and the attitude are. The bigger the difference, the more likely it's due to cognitive dissonance. The smaller the difference, the more likely it's due to self-perception theory. Okay, so for the exam, you should know the differences between self-perception theory and cognitive dissonance theory. Remember, the key difference, well, there's really two that are related. One of the key differences is that you only experience arousal in cognitive dissonance theory, not in self-perception theory. And because you experience that arousal in cognitive dissonance theory, that creates an uncomfortable feeling that you're trying to reduce, which you reduce by justifying and rationalizing your past behavior. In self-perception theory, there's no justification, there's no rationalizing, there's no lying to yourself, there's nothing like that. We're just come to rational conclusions based on thinking about our past behavior. Okay, we have just enough time to get quiz number 6 in. So let's go to Top Hat and do that. And the exam is going to be 30 multiple choice questions, just like the first exam. So open up your Top Hat accounts. I think all of these questions have to do with cognitive dissonance and or self-perception theory. So first question is something we've talked about today. According to cognitive dissonance theory, why do people like a fraternity more if they underwent severe hazing? In other words, they suffered through an initiation in order to join it. Is it because A, they felt the need to justify their desire to haze the next group of people? B, because they infer that they must like the group if they went through all that suffering? C, because downplaying their suffering makes them appear capable to other people? Or D, because it's a way to justify having gone through all of that suffering? Yeah, 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so of course, according to cognitive dissonance theory, we've got to justify that for which we've suffered, right? It's a way to justify having gone through all that suffering, which is option D. Good. B would be self-perception theory, right? So a self-perception theorist would say that these people, when trying to figure out, do I like the group I'm part of? Well, last week I went through this initiation where I suffered for the group. And I would only do that if I liked the group. So therefore I must like the group, right? So B is actually a description of self-perception theory in that explanation. Okay, remember the word infer is basically linked to self-perception theory. If you're inferring, you're coming to a conclusion about, then that means it's self-perception theory. We talked about this last class. When severe and mild threats were used in an attempt to prevent children from engaging in a prohibited activity, which of the following happened? A, only the severe threat was strong enough to keep the children from engaging in the prohibited activity. B, both threats deterred the children, kept them from engaging in that activity, but those given the mild threat showed greater internalization of the rule. C, both threats kept the children from engaging in that activity, but those given the severe threats showed greater internalization of the rule. Or D, neither threat was successful in getting the children to internalize the rule. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so if you recall, this is where the kids were told not to play with the toy. What happened is that both of the threats were able to keep the children from playing with the toy. So none of the kids played with it. But what happened is that those kids who were given the mild threat came to convince themselves that they never really wanted to play with it anyway. The kids given the severe threat, they didn't play with the toy, but they knew they were only not playing with it because of the threats. They never internalized the rule. And that is why B is the correct answer there. Question 3. Leslie has a belief that she's a very hardworking student, but the night before a big exam, instead of studying, she plays video games for 3 hours. This causes her cognitive dissonance. If she were to reduce her dissonance by adding a consonant cognition, which of the following might she do? So A, convince herself that she already knows the material and therefore doesn't need to study. B, convince herself that the exam isn't that important anyway. C, convince herself that she had to play video games because her younger brother needed someone to play with. Or D, convince herself that playing video games allows her to relax so that she can concentrate better later. At 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so adding a consonant cognition means adding a new belief that's consistent with your behavior and your attitude. So the best example of that would be option D. So if you convince yourself that playing video games allows you to relax, you can concentrate better later, well, then it's consistent with your idea that you're a hardworking student or that you're going to do well in the exam because it's helping you do well in the exam later on. So that belief is consistent with her behavior as well as her attitude, which is why D is the best answer. All of these are options to reduce cognitive dissonance, but this is the one that's adding a consonant cognition. Question 4. One of the main differences between cognitive dissonance theory and self-perception theory is that in self-perception theory, A, there's no motivation, B, there's no attitude change, C, people change their attitudes only if other people are present, or D, attitude change is only temporary. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, now you might be wondering here because I just said in class that the difference is that there's arousal in cognitive dissonance theory and there's not arousal in self-perception theory, right? So you got to take that one step farther. When you have that negative arousal in cognitive dissonance theory, that means you're motivated to get rid of that arousal. In self-perception theory, you don't have any motivation to get rid of arousal because there is no arousal. So that's why one of the main differences is A, there's no motivation. Okay, so obviously that was a little bit tricky because I phrased it a little bit differently. There absolutely is attitude change in self-perception theory, right? There's attitude change in both cognitive dissonance theory or self-perception theory. The only difference is how you got there. And you got there by reducing the uncomfortable arousal in cognitive dissonance theory because you're motivated to reduce that arousal, whereas you got there through a rational inferential process with self-perception theory. Okay, that was a little tricky, but I guess it's better on a quiz that you might drop later than an exam. Last question. Self-perception theory explains attitude change when A, people know what their true attitudes are, B, the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is small, C, when the behavior produces negative consequences, or D, when people feel personally responsible for their attitude change. And yeah, I think because so many people got the last one wrong, I'm going to give everyone a point for the last one. Everyone can thank Catherine for that. Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. And this was the very last thing we talked about. So we talked about how cognitive dissonance theory occurs when the discrepancy between your behavior and your attitude is large, and self-perception occurs when the discrepancy is small. So B is the correct answer there. Okay, so make sure you study up on differences between self-perception theory and cognitive dissonance theory for the second exam. As I said, for question 4, the last question, I'll give everyone the point for that because so few people got that right, because it was kind of tricky. So I'll go change that right now. Okay, so just remember that exam 2 is next class. Make sure that you are on time and it'll work just like the last exam with your Top Hat account. Okay, all right guys, I will see you then. Good luck studying and I will post a study guide shortly.